July 25, 1946, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. Dawn comes quickly in the tropics, as if the sun has been waiting just below the horizon, impatient. The lagoon lies flat and bright, a mirror polished by heat. Salt clings to the rails and dries on skin. Beyond the reef, the Pacific breathes in long, slow swells, but inside the lagoon the water is contained and quiet enough that the anchored ships look as if they have been placed there by hand. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, landing craft, a fleet arranged not for war, but for measurement. Cameras wait on towers. Instruments wait behind sealed doors. Observers wait at distance with dark glasses in their hands and an old instinct in their bodies: turn away, cover the eyes, brace for impact, because in a few moments the ocean itself will be struck from below by a nuclear detonation. What is about to happen here is called Operation Crossroads, and it is the first time the post-war world watches the United States test atomic weapons on warships with the eyes of an invited audience and a press corps. A target fleet of 95 ships has been assembled in Bikini Lagoon. The first test, Able, detonated above the ships on July 1, 1946, did not deliver the clean, annihilating verdict that some expected. It missed its aim point by more than 2,000 feet, and the resulting damage, though real, was uneven, enough to raise questions and provoke criticism, enough to leave room for argument. The second test, Baker, the one the observers will remember as the day the sea itself became a carrier of poison, will detonate 90 feet underwater on July 25, 1946. A third test, Charlie, will be planned and then cancelled, largely because what Baker does to the ships will be more stubborn than the Navy's confidence, and more persistent than any blast wave. To the sailors and officers from Allied navies who find themselves near this American spectacle, through liaison, observation missions, and the post-war machinery of cooperation, the shock is not simply the bomb. Many have already lived through extreme violence and have learned to recognize destruction in 1,000 forms. They have watched ships burn in convoy lanes and narrow seas. They have watched their own fleet stretched thin by necessity, held together by rationed steel and exhausted crews, and patched in ports that still smell of smoke. What stuns them is the American decision to turn surplus into demonstration. A nation that can assemble a fleet only to sacrifice it for data is a nation speaking a new dialect of power, confidence expressed as expendability. That dialect has been forming long before Bikini, in shipyards and supply depots and training stations, in the paperwork of procurement and the mathematics of fuel consumption. The war has ended, but the numbers behind it are still fresh enough to feel unreal. On VJ Day, the U.S. Navy's active ship total stood at 6,768. By June 30, 1946, less than a year later, active ships had fallen to 1,248. It is an astonishing contraction, and it is not a collapse. It is a managed demobilization performed at scale, an oceanic force reduced rapidly because it was built beyond immediate necessity. For many Allied sailors, this is the first post-war lesson. America does not shrink like a nation exhausted. It shrinks like a nation reorganizing. Most navies end wars by counting what they cannot replace. America ends this war by deciding what to do with what it has too much of. And so the question, quiet at first, then unavoidable, spreads through Allied mess decks and wardrooms as ships visit American ports and Americans visit theirs. What really happens to America's Navy boats after the war? Some are decommissioned and preserved. Some are sold and scrapped. Some are transferred to other flags. Some are sunk as targets. Some are anchored in long lines, silent and waiting, in reserve fleets that look like ghost cities made of steel. In the American vocabulary, even the end of a ship's life can be organized into categories: retention and non-retention, custody and disposal, because to the United States, ships are not only symbols. They are assets, and assets are managed. The warship, once a sacred national object, becomes something closer to an entry in a ledger, kept, moved, or eliminated according to policy rather than emotion. The visible symbol of that policy is the mothball fleet, reserve groups of inactive vessels held afloat with enough care that they can be reactivated if the world turns dangerous again. Many Allied nations have reserves, most do. But the American reserve has a different quality. It does not feel like a leftover. It feels like an option made physical. In quiet waters, hulls wait in rows and clusters, their silhouettes repeating into distance, as if the war has not ended so much as been folded and stored. And alongside naval reserve fleets, there is another phenomenon that reveals the same national instinct from a different angle, the National Defense Reserve Fleet, created under Section 11 of the Merchant Ship Sales Act of 1946 to provide reserve shipping for national defense and emergencies. At its height in 1950, it consists of 2,277 ships across 8 anchorages, an extraordinary figure that suggests not merely preparedness, but stored potential on an industrial scale. A reserve measured in the thousands feels to many Allied observers like a second Navy sleeping in American waters, waiting for a future crisis the way a warehouse waits for an order. A photograph of these reserve fleets can look like a trick of perspective, rows of ships in calm water, their profiles repeating to the horizon, their decks stripped of wartime clutter, their hulls held in quiet preservation. Sassoon Bay becomes one of the better-known sites for such scenes. From above, the ships appear arranged like books on a shelf, too many, too orderly, too patient to be accidental. To Allied sailors, these images make the American post-war situation legible at a glance. The United States is not merely surviving the transition to peace. It is warehousing power. But the other side of that same abundance is more unsettling. Because when a nation can store ships by the hundreds or thousands, it can also choose to destroy them without fear of weakening itself. Operation Crossroads is the purest expression of that truth, and it is designed to be watched. In Bikini Lagoon, the target fleet includes not only American ships but captured Axis vessels. Among them the Japanese battleship Nagato and the German cruiser Prinz Eugen, placed into the formation like trophies offered up to the future. The stated goal is to study nuclear effects on ships. But the test carries political weight that cannot be separated from the science. It is a public demonstration that the post-war world's dominant naval power is willing to put the very idea of the battle fleet on trial under atomic fire. And it is also, in its own way, a struggle over budgets and influence in an era when air power and atomic weapons threaten to erase old categories. In the background of Crossroads, there is an argument: if the fleet is obsolete, then the Navy must accept a smaller share of the post-war world. If the fleet can survive, then the Navy can claim the future. The ships, lined up in Bikini Lagoon, are not merely steel. They are evidence in a case being made to Congress, to the public, and to rival services. The first detonation, Able, is an airburst. A 23-kiloton device is dropped from a B-29 and detonates about 520 feet above the target fleet. It misses the aim point by more than 2,000 feet, and the blast does not deliver the decisive cinematic destruction that some expected. The results become an argument rather than a verdict. Some observers at great distance feel little shock and treat it as disappointment. Critics point to the miss and demand deeper lessons. The test, though historic, leaves room for doubt. Baker will erase doubt, but it will do so in a way that no one fully anticipates. Baker detonates underwater, 90 feet down. The blast does not merely crush steel, it transforms the lagoon itself into a weapon. A spray dome surges upward in a fraction of a second, followed by a hollow column of water that climbs thousands of feet into the sky. A base surge spreads outward, dense, wet, radioactive, crawling across the water's surface like a moving wall. The ships that survive the immediate violence are coated in contamination carried by sea spray. Radiation does not behave like fire. It does not burn out. It clings. It settles. It hides in seams and paint and cable runs. And so the struggle to decontaminate those hulls becomes one of the defining outcomes of the operation. The planned third test is ultimately cancelled, in large part because the Navy cannot adequately clean what it has made poisonous. This is one of the shocks to Allied sailors after the war. The realization that a ship can survive the blast and still become unusable, alive, afloat, and yet unfit for human hands. In the old naval imagination, survival is buoyancy. In the atomic imagination, survival includes purity. Steel can remain above water and still be defeated by invisible dust and wet spray. Even among American scientific leadership, Baker acquires a darker meaning. Glenn T. Seaborg, chemist and later chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, will call Baker the world's first nuclear disaster. It is a phrase that captures the moral turning in the story. The bomb does not merely end wars. It introduces a new category of aftermath, one that cannot be cleaned away with courage, one that does not yield to tradition, one that turns victory into a long contamination of responsibility. And there is another turning that Allied observers cannot ignore, because it is baked into the very location of the test. Bikini's native population, 167 islanders, is removed from their ancestral home so that the United States can stage Crossroads. They are told it is, for the good of mankind. One account records the local chieftain's acceptance: "We are willing to go. Everything is in God's hands." It is one of the most haunting lines in the entire atomic age, because it is spoken without anger and without leverage, only resignation offered to power. For Allied sailors, men from democracies and empires alike, this displacement adds a shadow to the American demonstration. It suggests that American abundance can be generous to its own people and still ruthless to those at its periphery. Power, they understand, always has a geography. It can be warm and nourishing at the center, cold and indifferent at the edge. Yet the same Allied observers also understand something else, something that cannot be dismissed as mere imperial habit. The United States does not reach this position by accident. It reaches it through a particular kind of national organization, an industrial democracy capable of turning civilian production into naval endurance, and then turning naval endurance into strategic inevitability. And it is here, far from Bikini, back in the wartime Pacific, that a different kind of American post-war shock begins to make sense. Not the shock of nuclear fire, but the shock of logistics so abundant that it borders on the surreal. A recurring symbol explains it best: a paper cup of ice cream. During the war, the U.S. Navy employs what becomes known as ice cream barges, BRLs, barges refrigerated large. Towed vessels used to store frozen and refrigerated food and to produce ice cream in large quantities for sailors and Marines in the Pacific. One such barge, retrofitted from a concrete vessel, can store immense amounts of frozen provisions, meat by the ton, vegetables and dairy by the hundredweight, and can produce ice cream at a rate described in stark, industrial terms. 10 gallons every 7 minutes, roughly 500 gallons per shift, with storage capacity of 2,000 gallons at a time. At a time when much of the world lives under rationing and shortage, the American fleet tows a floating factory of cold sweetness through tropical seas. The paper cup matters because it carries the entire American system inside it. It is not simply dessert. It is the visible tip of an iceberg made of trains, farms, factories, ports, tankers, refrigerated holds, spare parts, and forms stamped in offices far from the front. It means that somewhere behind the battle line there are ships devoted not to guns but to refrigeration, behind them warehouses, behind them railroads, behind them factories, behind them farms, behind them a homeland protected by oceans and driven by mass production. A sailor holding a paper cup of ice cream is holding an entire economy in his hands, frozen, portable, and taken for granted. This is not a trivial detail of morale. It is a physical manifestation of political economy. It is a reminder that modern war is not won only by courage at the moment of contact, but by the ability to sustain a human being across long distances for long periods, without allowing exhaustion to become collapse. It also reveals something that enemy soldiers and sailors often misjudge. In German and Japanese ideological training, the United States is frequently imagined as soft, too comfortable, too consumer-oriented, too individualistic to sustain hardship. Discipline, they believe, belongs to societies that demand sacrifice and suppress desire. They expect that American abundance will make Americans unwilling to pay in blood and time. They expect that democracies will crack under pressure because democracies indulge. But what many of them experience, especially those who come closest to the American machine, whether in combat, captivity, or occupation, is the opposite. Abundance does not prevent sacrifice. It enables persistence. A democracy that can feed its sailors well, rotate ships, replace equipment, and maintain morale can endure long wars without collapsing inward. Abundance, in this sense, is not weakness. It is fuel. It keeps the machine coherent. It keeps the war from turning into starvation. Even American slang preserves this connection between comfort and endurance. In U.S. Navy usage, Gedunk comes to refer to junk food, originally ice cream, and also to the shipboard snack bar where it is sold. The word itself is unimportant. What matters is that the Navy develops an internal vocabulary for sweetness as if sweetness is a system. And it is. Ice cream and other comforts are treated as essential for morale, calories, and the human tolerance of heat and fear. The very existence of such rituals signals how systematically the U.S. Navy integrates comfort into wartime life. There is a remembered anecdote from the culture: officers attempting to pull rank to cut in line for ice cream, only to be rebuked, then discovering Admiral Bull Halsey himself waiting in line with everyone else. Whether preserved for its humor or its moral, the story carries a democratic scent. The line matters. The rule matters. The shared ritual of waiting for a scoop becomes a miniature of the society that builds the fleet. In authoritarian systems, hierarchy is a comfort, it insulates. In a democracy at war, hierarchy exists, but it must sometimes stand in line with the men it commands. Even when the story is polished by time, it hints at something real, that the American war effort is built not only on production, but on an ideology of shared participation. So the paper cup returns again and again in this story, because it is the simplest object that can carry the largest meaning. It is abundance made ordinary. It is morale turned into policy. It is the taste of a homeland delivered cold across an ocean. And after the war, when Allied sailors look at what happens to America's boats, when they see mothball fleets, reserve anchorages, scrapping yards, transfers, and atomic target formations, they are seeing the same principle expressed in steel rather than sugar. A country that can produce beyond need can also choose beyond need. They expect the U.S. Navy, like all navies, to cling to hulls because hulls are scarce. They expect careful preservation of every cruiser, every destroyer, every carrier, because that is what their own governments would have done with such assets. Scarcity teaches reverence. Scarcity makes every ship feel like a child that must be protected. What they see instead is the United States treating ships as a spectrum of purposes, some to keep, some to mothball, some to dispose of, some to donate, some to test, some to sink. This is not callousness in the simple sense. It is strategic posture made possible by industrial overflow. The American mind can treat a ship as both sacred in battle and disposable in peace, because it can build another. It can afford to treat steel as a means rather than an end. Operation Crossroads makes this visible in a way that cannot be forgotten. 95 ships assembled, packed tighter than wartime spacing because realism is less important than data density. The tests are staged with immense resources. Drones and instrumented aircraft, towers loaded with cameras, a supporting apparatus so large it resembles a small campaign. The operation is both scientific and theatrical, an event in which the act of watching is part of the message. A nation that can spend so much effort photographing an explosion is a nation that understands perception as a strategic domain. Even the commanding admiral must answer rumors that collect around the atomic age like fog. Vice Admiral W.H.P. Blandy speaks with a kind of weary firmness, insisting the bomb will not blow out the bottom of the sea, will not destroy gravity, will not turn the world into a cartoonish apocalypse. His words are aimed at public fear, but they also reveal the new atmosphere of uncertainty. The world has entered a period where imagination runs ahead of physics, and navies must fight myths as well as enemies. For Allied sailors, that uncertainty fuses with a more personal sensation. The feeling that the war they fought, of gunnery and torpedoes, convoy escorts and carrier strikes, has already become old. The United States is not merely ending the war. It is replacing the rules of the next one in public. And still, the most human shock comes from what is small, not what is catastrophic. In ports and bases, in joint facilities and occupation zones, Allied servicemen encounter the American system in its everyday form: stores, supplies, standardized equipment, paperwork that moves quickly, food that arrives reliably, spare parts that exist in quantity. To men who have lived under rationing, the American ability to provide not only necessities but extras feels like encountering a different civilization, one that has not been hollowed by blockade or bombardment. The war has been global, but its burdens have been unevenly distributed. Europe has been bombed and starved. Japan has been blockaded and burned. Britain has rationed for years. The Soviet Union has bled itself across the plains. America has suffered and sacrificed, but its homeland has not been ground into powder. Its factories have expanded rather than collapsed. Its farms have produced rather than withered. Its ports have shipped rather than been sealed. This difference is not a moral claim, it is geography and industrial capacity turned into strategy. The ice cream barge becomes a kind of legend not because it wins battles directly, but because it symbolizes that the United States is fighting the war with one hand on the helm and the other on a conveyor belt. The barge does not carry guns. It carries frozen meat and vegetables and dairy. It makes ice cream in bulk. It is a ship built from the premise that war will be won not only by bravery, but by sustained comfort made possible through industrial reach. The enemy's emotional contrast, expectation versus experience, is therefore profound. A German soldier raised on the idea that democracies are decadent may look at American abundance and interpret it as rot. A Japanese serviceman raised on austerity may interpret it as softness. But the experience of the war's later years, the steady tightening of blockade, the gradual disappearance of fuel, the shrinking of rations, the inability to replace losses at the same rate, teaches another lesson: the side that can keep producing, keep feeding, keep replacing, can outlast courage. Sacrifice is not abolished by abundance. It is made sustainable. In the American fleet, abundance does not eliminate hardship. It simply ensures that hardship does not become starvation. That distinction matters. It means fatigue does not automatically become collapse. It means a sailor can be exhausted and still be fed, still be supplied, still be part of a machine that remains coherent. It means a fleet can stay at sea. That coherence is what Allied sailors see when they look at the post-war disposition of U.S. ships. A country that can reduce its active fleet from 6,768 ships at VJ Day to 1,248 by mid-1946 can do so because it has systems, bureaucratic, industrial, political, capable of absorbing enormous change without disintegration. The same administrative strength that builds a fleet can also dismantle it, store it, redistribute it, or sacrifice parts of it for science. In other nations, demobilization is often a bleeding. In America, it is a reconfiguration. This is why the mothball fleets and reserve anchorages are not merely storage sites. They are statements about time. In many nations, the end of war means the end of readiness. In the American case, readiness can be preserved as an option, kept afloat, categorized, protected against corrosion, held in reserve. Reserve fleets exist not as nostalgia, but as insurance. An insurance on that scale suggests a national temperament: prepare not only for what is likely, but for what is possible, and do it with enough depth that the preparation itself becomes a form of deterrence. Yet the atomic test at Bikini also reveals the moral cost of such depth. The displacement of Bikini's islanders, carried out so the tests can be staged, becomes part of the event's legacy. The islanders have the impression their relocation will be temporary, but the islands become uninhabitable due to subsequent nuclear testing. The story of the ships cannot be separated from the story of the place. Both become instruments in a demonstration that claims to be for humanity while extracting its price from a small community that cannot refuse. This is the transformation that Crossroads produces in perception, especially among sailors, and it is double-edged. On one side, it confirms that naval war in the atomic age will be shaped not only by armor and gunnery, but by radiation, contamination, and the long tail of aftermath. Ships can become unusable without sinking. Harbors can become dangerous without being mined. The sea can carry invisible harm. The ocean, once a shield and a road, can become a medium for poison. On the other side, it confirms that America's capacity, its ability to assemble, supply, and sacrifice a fleet, is so large that it can shape the global imagination. In the post-war world, fear will be organized not only by weapons, but by the spectacle of weapons tested and narrated. And still, through all of this, the mothball fleets, the reserve anchorages, the target formations, the cancelled third test, the displaced islanders, one small object continues to recur like a refrain because it captures the essence of what Allied sailors find most disorienting about American power: a paper cup of ice cream. In wartime, that cup means the American system can deliver comfort across thousands of miles of ocean. In peacetime, it means something else: the same system can deliver choices about what to do with thousands of ships. The sweetness is not the point. The point is the infrastructure behind the sweetness, and the political culture that insists ordinary men should be sustained, not merely used up. The cup also carries a subtle ideological scent. Democracies often present themselves as societies of queues rather than privileges, of shared rationing rather than aristocratic exemption. Even when the material reality falls short, the myth persists, fairness expressed as process. A sailor waiting in line at the Gedunk bar, waiting his turn for a scoop, is participating in a ritual of equality that authoritarian systems mock but cannot easily reproduce without undermining themselves. The line is a small democracy, repeated daily, as ordinary as breathing. That is why the paper cup becomes a symbol not only of abundance but of democratic habit. It is a small container that implies a large promise, that comfort is not reserved for the few, that morale matters, that the state must serve the ordinary sailor because the ordinary sailor is the state. Now return, in memory, to Bikini Lagoon. The fleet is anchored. The observers are distant. The moment of detonation is counted down not in human emotion but in procedure. And then Baker erupts, and the ocean rises into a towering column and a spreading, wet cloud. Ships that have steamed into battle now sit shrouded in contamination, their decks slick with fallout carried by water. The event is filmed and photographed from every angle, and the images travel the world as proof that the age of the battleship is ending and the age of atomic consequence has begun. To Allied sailors, the shock is not only the force. It is the message embedded in what comes after. Some of those ships will never return to service. Some will be scuttled. Some will be scrapped. Some will remain contaminated problems. Even victory has leftovers that cannot be neatly stored. The Americans have abundance, but the atomic age introduces a kind of waste that resists the normal logic of salvage. You cannot repaint a deck until it is safe to touch. You cannot simply hose down the sea. You cannot tow away the consequences. This, too, changes ideology. Before the bomb, abundance is an unambiguous advantage. More ships, more fuel, more food, more replacements. After the bomb, abundance also means something darker. More targets, more exposure, more complex cleanup, more moral responsibility for what is done in the name of science and security. The United States can stage Crossroads because it has surplus, but Crossroads ensures that the surplus will never feel purely innocent again. It will always carry the shadow of what surplus makes possible. And yet the post-war decades that follow confirm the first lesson more often than the second, that American industrial democracy, whatever its contradictions, can sustain global naval presence, store vast reserves, and reorganize power with administrative calm. The reserve fleets remain a tangible expression of that. The National Defense Reserve Fleet's peak, 2,277 ships in layup in 1950, is not simply a statistic. It is a portrait of a nation preparing to face new emergencies by preserving old steel in quiet waters. For Allied sailors, this becomes the final shock. The United States is not merely a wartime ally. It becomes the central shipyard, the central warehouse, the central manager of maritime capacity in a world that has been shattered. Its boats do not simply vanish after the war. They are sorted and reassigned like assets in a ledger that spans oceans. Some end in silence, anchored in reserve lines. Some end in flame, cut apart for scrap. Some end in spectacle, battered and contaminated under atomic tests. Some end in new service elsewhere, under other flags, carrying American steel into new geopolitical arrangements. And even when those hulls are gone, the method remains, a belief that power can be manufactured, stored, and demonstrated, not only through weapons, but through the infrastructure that keeps weapons and men moving. In the end, the paper cup of ice cream explains the steel more clearly than the steel explains itself. Because the cup is the simplest proof of an idea, that abundance, when organized, becomes endurance, and endurance, when married to ideology, becomes destiny. The sailors who watch American ships lined up in reserve fleets, who hear about thousands held in layup, who see warships sacrificed at Bikini, are not only witnessing what happens to boats. They are witnessing what happens to a world when one nation can afford both to preserve and to waste, both to feed its sailors sweetness and to salt a lagoon with invisible poison. The epilogue of that lesson is not triumphant. It is cautionary. A society that can deliver ice cream across an ocean can also deliver war across an ocean. A society that can store thousands of ships can also choose to sacrifice dozens for spectacle. Abundance is not morality. It is capacity. Democracy is not innocence. It is a claim that ordinary people matter, and that power must justify itself in public. Even when the justification is imperfect, even when the costs are borne far from the cameras. On some American ship, somewhere in the vast post-war Pacific, a sailor lifts a paper cup and watches the ice cream soften in the heat. It melts the way all victories melt, slowly, inevitably, into something that must be managed before it becomes a stain. And that is the larger truth that Allied sailors carry away when they ask what really happens to America's Navy boats after the war. They are stored, they are sold, they are scrapped, they are sunk, they are tested, they are displayed, and through every ending runs the same quiet American constant, the ability to produce more than necessity, and the burden of deciding what to do with the excess.